On a cold, cloudy morning, silence filled an abandoned school where the wind swirled leaves through broken glass. A man with a weary look parks by the rusted gate and hurries out to search through the debris. Inside the building, a baby in blue pajamas walks alone, tripping over old books and toppled chairs, seeing an injured German shepherd among the rubble. The baby offers a cookie. The dog, covered in dried blood, gently licks the child's fingers. The man enters, freezes at the sight, and quietly approaches. But as he moves, a horse across the street rears up and whinnies, startled. The father grabs his son and carries the dog, running to the car. What happens next? No one is ready to see. Love animal stories? Then subscribe now and never miss one. Thanks for being with us. Now, back to our story. The cutting silence of an overcast morning set the somber tone of a place where life seemed to have been forgotten. In the courtyard of an abandoned school in Oak Ridge, Michigan, the winds blew persistently, carrying dry leaves and dust through empty corridors. Only the glass shards scattered across the floor revealed that at some point this space had been full of movement. Beneath one of the shattered windows, hidden among the debris of chairs and torn posters, a German shepherd trembled in pain, its thin body covered in dirt, its swollen left hind leg immobilized by pain. The animal did not growl or bark, just breathed with difficulty, trying to stay conscious amid the loneliness of the decaying structure. The old Oak Ridge Elementary had been abandoned for nearly a decade, a casualty of the economic downturn that had devastated this once thriving industrial town. The building stood as a ghostly reminder of better days, its walls now covered in graffiti, its playground silent. Few people ventured near it anymore, except for the occasional teenager looking for thrills or homeless seeking shelter from harsh Michigan winters. What no one could imagine was that at that very moment, just a few meters away, a baby, just over a year old, was approaching the rusty entrance of the old school, wearing faded blue pajamas and with a blanket dragging across the concrete floor. The child walked with unstable but determined steps. There were no adults nearby. No voice called him, no hand guided him. Still, he seemed to know where to go. As he crossed the fallen gate, he headed directly toward the main hall, as if drawn by something invisible. Jason Mason had just finished his night shift at the local factory when he received the frantic call from his wife, Sarah. Their son, little Ethan, had somehow managed to unlock the back door of their modest two-story home just 3 blocks from the abandoned school. Sarah had only stepped into the shower for a few minutes, assuming Ethan was still asleep in his crib. The panic in her voice sent chills down Jason's spine as he rushed home from work. "I've looked everywhere in the house and the backyard, Jason. He's gone," Sarah sobbed into the phone. "I called Mrs. Thompson next door, but she hasn't seen him either. I'm going crazy." "I'm 5 minutes away," Jason replied, his heart pounding as he ran to his truck. "Call 911. I'll search the streets." On my way home, Jason knew every inch of their neighborhood. It was the same place he had grown up in, where generations of his family had lived through the town's rise and fall. As he drove frantically through the quiet morning streets, scanning every yard and alley, a sickening feeling grew in his stomach. How far could a 1-year-old possibly go? The thought of Ethan, their miracle baby, who had come after years of trying, alone in the cold morning, made his hands shake on the steering wheel. After searching the most obvious places, the playground, 2 blocks away, the convenience store where they often bought Ethan's favorite apple juice, even the small pond at the end of their street, Jason's desperation grew. He had almost given up when, driving past the abandoned school, something caught his eye. A small piece of blue fabric was caught on the rusty fence surrounding the property, the same shade as Ethan's pajamas. Jason slammed on the brakes, nearly causing an accident with a passing car. Without bothering to properly park, he jumped out and ran toward the fence. His hands trembled as he picked up the piece of fabric. It was soft, the kind of flannel Ethan's pajamas were made of. But how could his son have wandered so far? The school was at least 6 blocks from their home, and Ethan had just started walking confidently a few weeks ago. "Ethan!" Jason called out, his voice echoing against the empty building. "Ethan, are you here? It's Daddy!" There was no response, except for the haunting whistle of wind through broken windows. Jason climbed over the fallen section of the fence, ignoring the tear in his jeans as a loose piece of metal caught the fabric. The courtyard was littered with years of neglect, discarded bottles, crumbling concrete, and overgrown weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement. The main entrance doors hung off their hinges, creating a dark, gaping mouth into the building. The moment when the small, curious eyes met the exhausted gaze of the injured dog, something was established between the two. The baby stopped a few steps away, watching attentively. In his hand, he held a half-eaten baby biscuit, which he extended slowly and carefully. The German Shepherd raised its head with difficulty, sniffing the air by instinct. In a gesture that contradicted any logical prediction, the animal accepted the food, gently licking the child's fingers. Meanwhile, outside, the baby's father roamed the neighborhood streets in despair. His search had already lasted nearly an hour since he noticed the empty crib and the slightly open back door. The man knew the surroundings well, but the abandoned school was the last place he would think to look until he saw, by chance, the blue blanket caught between the rusty bars. His heart raced. He ran in, and soon the image he saw made time stop. His son, kneeling beside an injured dog, exchanging caresses and crumbs. Without immediately understanding, but guided by an intuition stronger than fear, Jason approached, observing the open wound on the animal's leg. The baby pointed insistently at the paw, babbling unintelligible sounds, as if pleading for help. After a brief moment of hesitation, the man wrapped the dog with his jacket and took it to the car, with his son in his arms. "Ethan, how did you even get here?" Jason whispered, holding his son close, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. He quickly texted Sarah, "Found him. He's safe, coming home now." He couldn't bring himself to tell her where their son had been found, or about the injured dog that Ethan seemed so determined to help. Not yet. First, he needed to understand what was happening himself. The closest veterinary clinic was 20 minutes away, but each minute seemed endless. As Jason drove, occasionally glancing at Ethan, who sat in his car seat, happily babbling and pointing at the injured dog wrapped in Jason's work jacket. He couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had just happened, something that defied rational explanation. How had Ethan known? What had drawn him so purposefully to this specific location, to this specific animal in need? The veterinary clinic was just opening when Jason pulled into the parking lot. Dr. Melissa Walker, a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, had just unlocked the doors when she saw Jason rushing toward the entrance, a child in one arm and a bundle wrapped in a jacket in the other. "Please," Jason said, out of breath. "This dog needs help. My son. He found him somehow." Dr. Walker didn't waste time asking questions. With practiced efficiency, she guided Jason to an examination room and carefully unwrapped the German Shepherd. The dog's eyes, though clouded with pain, remained surprisingly calm, occasionally looking toward Ethan as if seeking reassurance. It was then, as the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the clinic windows, that Jason noticed something else about the dog. A faded tattoo in its ear, barely visible beneath matted fur and dirt. Dr. Walker's examination was quick, but thorough. Her face grew increasingly concerned as she checked the dog's vitals and examined the infected wound on his hind leg. "This animal is severely dehydrated and malnourished," she said, reaching for an IV line. The infection in his leg is quite advanced. A few more days out there and... She trailed off, glancing at little Ethan, who was watching the proceedings with unusual focus for a child his age. Well, let's just say your son's timing was miraculous. As says, Dr. Walker and her assistant worked to stabilize the German Shepherd. Jason stepped outside to call Sarah. His wife had been frantic, despite his text message assuring her that Ethan was safe. When he explained where he'd found their son and about the injured dog, Sarah fell silent for so long that Jason thought the call had dropped. Sarah, are you there? You're telling me our 1-year-old son somehow walked 6 blocks through the neighborhood, found his way into an abandoned school building, and discovered an injured dog? Sarah's voice was quiet, disbelieving. Jason, that's not possible. He can barely navigate the living room without bumping into the coffee table. I know how it sounds, Jason replied, watching through the clinic window as Ethan placed his small hand on the examination table, inches from where the dog lay. I can't explain it either, but I saw it with my own eyes, Sarah. There was a connection between them. It was like Ethan knew exactly where to find him. Dr. Walker emerged from the examination room, removing her latex gloves. The dog is stabilized for now. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, with an infected wound that likely came from being caught in something, maybe fencing or metal debris. But there's something else you should know. She hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who was now being entertained by one of the vet techs. This isn't just any stray. The tattoo in his ear is a service animal identification. I've made some calls, and apparently this dog went missing during a search and rescue operation about 8 months ago in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania? Jason's eyebrows shot up. That's hundreds of miles from here. How did he end up in our town? Dr. Walker shook her head. No idea, but his name is Max, and he was highly trained, one of the best in the region, according to my contact. After a building collapse, Max was sent in to find survivors, but there was a secondary collapse. Everyone assumed he had been lost in the incident. They searched for weeks, but eventually had to declare him, well, they had to stop looking. Jason stared through the window at the German Shepherd. Despite his condition, there was a dignity to the animal, a steady intelligence in his eyes that seemed at odds with his circumstances. Will he recover? With proper care, yes. The leg will heal, though he might always have a slight limp. The bigger question is what happens next. His original handler has since retired and moved abroad. The search and rescue team would probably want him back, but given his condition and the trauma he's likely experienced, she let the sentence hang. We'll take him, Jason said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I mean, if that's possible. I'd need to talk to my wife, but I think this was meant to be. Dr. Walker smiled. Let's get him stable first. He'll need at least a week of care here before he can be released. That'll give you time to think it through and make arrangements. But I have to say, in all my years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything quite like the bond that seems to exist between your son and this dog. It's as if they've known each other forever. The week that followed was a blur of activity for the Mason family. Sarah, initially skeptical and concerned about bringing a formally trained rescue dog into their home, softened her stance after visiting Max at the clinic. Something about the way the German Shepherd's eyes followed Ethan's every movement, the gentle way he accepted the toddler's clumsy pats, convinced her that Dr. Walker was right. There was something special about their connection. Jason spent his evenings after work building a comfortable dog bed in the corner of their living room and researching the care of retired service animals. Sarah found herself purchasing premium dog food and an assortment of toys that she assured Jason were necessary for his rehabilitation. Even Mrs. Thompson next door, who had been terrified of dogs since being bitten as a child, brought over a handmade blanket for the hero dog, as she had taken to calling Max. The story of Ethan's inexplicable journey to the abandoned school and his discovery of Max had spread quickly through their small community. What had started as concerned neighbors relieved at the safe return of a missing child had evolved into something approaching local legend. Some dismissed it as coincidence or exaggeration, but others spoke in hushed tones about the special intuition of children, about connections that transcended ordinary explanation. On the day Max was finally released from Dr. Walker's care, a small crowd gathered outside the clinic. Local news had picked up the story, and a reporter from the regional paper was there to document the reunion. Jason felt uncomfortable with the attention, but recognized that their story had touched something in people, a need for hope, perhaps, in a town that had seen more than its share of hardship. Max emerged from the clinic walking gingerly, his left hind leg still bandaged but bearing weight. The moment he saw Ethan, who was being held in Sarah's arms, his demeanor changed. His ears perked up, and his tail, which had been hanging low, began to wag tentatively. Dr. Walker removed his leash, and Max moved directly to Sarah and Ethan, sitting obediently at their feet and looking up with unwavering attention. "Go ahead." "Ethan," Sarah said softly, lowering their son to the ground. Ethan toddled forward with his arms outstretched, giggling with delight. "Max!" he exclaimed clearly, his first recognizable word beyond mama and dada. The crowd of onlookers gasped, and Sarah's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. Max gently nuzzled Ethan's cheek, accepting the toddler's enthusiastic hug with patience that seemed to confirm Dr. Walker's assessment. This was no ordinary bond. The adjustment to life with Max was surprisingly smooth. Despite his training as a search and rescue dog, he seemed perfectly content with his new role as family companion. He slept beside Ethan's crib each night, alert to every sound and movement. During the day, he followed the toddler around the house with patient vigilance, positioning himself strategically whenever Ethan attempted anything remotely risky. It was Sarah who first noticed Max's extraordinary protective instincts. She had been folding laundry in the bedroom while Ethan played in the hallway just outside the door. A sudden bark, the first they had heard from Max, made her jump. She rushed out to find Max, gently but firmly tugging at Ethan's pajamas, pulling him away from the staircase where the safety gate had somehow come unlatched. "Jason!" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. "Come look at the security camera footage." The home security system they had installed after Ethan's disappearance had captured the entire incident. On the small monitor, they watched as Ethan toddled toward the stairs, the gate swinging open as he touched it. Before he could take another step, Max had moved with surprising speed, using his teeth to carefully grasp Ethan's clothing and pull him to safety. "He saved him," Sarah whispered, tears in her eyes. "If Ethan had fallen down those stairs," Jason put his arm around his wife's shoulders, "it's like he was sent to us, like he was meant to find Ethan, or Ethan was meant to find him." That night, after Ethan was asleep and Max had taken his customary position beside the crib, Jason found Sarah watching old news footage on her laptop. "What are you looking at?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. "The building collapse where Max went missing," Sarah replied, her voice hushed. "I was curious about what happened. It was an old apartment building in Pittsburgh. There was a gas leak, and then," she gestured, "at the screen where emergency vehicles surrounded a partially collapsed structure. Several people were trapped inside. They sent in rescue dogs to locate survivors. Jason leaned closer, watching as the camera panned across a line of handlers and dogs, waiting to be deployed. And there was Max, younger and more robust, but unmistakable with his distinctive markings. His handler's name was Frank Miller. Sarah continued. He retired after the incident, apparently never quite recovered from losing Max. According to this article, he moved to Arizona for his health. They interviewed him 6 months after the collapse, and he said something that gives me chills. She scrolled down to a quote highlighted in the article. Max wasn't just any rescue dog. He had an intuition that went beyond training. If there was someone to be found, Max would find them, no matter what stood in his way. That's why I can't accept that he's gone. Somewhere out there, Max is still trying to complete his mission. He wouldn't give up until he did. Spring turned to summer in Oak Ridge, and the Mason household settled into a new normal. Max's presence had transformed their home in ways both obvious and subtle. The German Shepherd had recovered remarkably, well under Dr. Walker's care and the loving attention of his new family. Though he still favored his left hind leg slightly when tired, he had regained much of his strength and agility. For Jason and Sarah, the most profound change was in Ethan. Their son, who had been somewhat delayed in his speech development, began stringing words together with surprising rapidity. Dr. Ramirez, Ethan's pediatrician, remarked on the change during his 18-month checkup. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up," the doctor said, watching as Ethan babbled happily to Max, who sat attentively beside the examination table. "I've seen therapy animals work wonders with children before, but this is remarkable progress in just a few months." What Dr. Ramirez didn't see, what Jason and Sarah witnessed daily, were the quieter moments that defied explanation. Like the morning when Ethan woke with a slight fever, and before either parent realized he was unwell, Max had already positioned himself beside the crib, whining softly until Sarah came to check. Or the afternoon when a severe thunderstorm knocked out power to their neighborhood, and Max led them to Ethan's favorite stuffed bear, hidden beneath the couch, before the first frightened cry could escape the toddler's lips. "It's as if they can read each other's minds," Sarah whispered to Jason one evening as they watched Ethan and Max playing in the backyard. Ethan would point silently in a direction, and Max would retrieve whatever toy lay there. When Max wanted water, he would look at his empty bowl, then at Ethan, who would immediately toddle to Sarah, tugging at her pants and saying, "Max thirsty," with perfect clarity. "Maybe they can," Jason replied, not entirely joking. "After everything that's happened, would that really be the strangest thing?" Their quiet reflection was interrupted by the ringing of Jason's phone. The caller ID showed Oak Ridge Tribune, the local newspaper that had covered Max and Ethan's story months earlier. "Mr. Mason, this is Diane Winters from the Tribune. I hope I'm not disturbing you." The reporter's voice was animated with excitement. "You're not going to believe this, but our story about your son and Max has gone viral. A national morning show picked it up, and they want to feature you, all of you, including Max." The national attention came swiftly and overwhelmingly. What had been a heartwarming local human interest story exploded into a social media phenomenon after the morning show segment aired. The image of Ethan, now approaching his second birthday, walking hand in leash with Max, captured the public's imagination. The hashtag Ethan and Max trended briefly on various platforms, accompanied by countless stories of extraordinary bonds between children and animals. With the attention came unexpected opportunities. A children's book publisher approached Sarah about a picture book based on Ethan and Max's story. A pet food company offered Max a year's supply of premium food in exchange for his image on their packaging. Dr. Walker's veterinary clinic saw an uptick in adoptions, with several families specifically requesting rescue dogs with special connections to their children. But not all the attention was welcome. Conspiracy theorists latched onto the more inexplicable aspects of the story. How Ethan had found his way to the abandoned school, how Max had traveled hundreds of miles from Pennsylvania to Michigan, the seemingly telepathic bond between child and dog. Online forums buzzed with wild speculations about government experiments, supernatural phenomena, and past life connections. "It's getting out of hand," Sarah said one evening, closing her laptop with a snap after reading yet another bizarre theory about their son. "I think we need to step back from all this publicity." Jason agreed. They declined further interviews and focused on protecting their family's privacy. But even as the media attention gradually waned, the Mason family found themselves facing a new challenge. A letter arrived from a law firm in Pittsburgh representing the search and rescue organization that had once owned and trained Max. "They want him back," Jason said, his voice tight with anger as he read the formal legal language. "They're claiming that since Max was never officially declared deceased or retired, he remains their property. They're demanding his return to service." Sarah's face paled. "They can't do that. Max is part of our family now, and he's not the same dog he was before. He has a special connection with Ethan. According to this letter, they don't care about that. They've invested thousands of dollars in his training, and now that they know he's alive, they want their asset back." Jason crumpled the letter in his fist. "I'll call Mike tomorrow. He'll know what our legal options are." Mike Donovan, a childhood friend of Jason's who had become a moderately successful lawyer in Detroit, wasn't encouraging when they met at his office the following week. "The problem is that legally they have a strong case," Mike explained, reviewing the documentation Jason had brought. "Service animals, especially those with specialized training like search and rescue dogs, are considered valuable assets. Max's disappearance was documented, but there was never a formal change in ownership." "So what are you saying?" Sarah asked, her hand unconsciously tightening around Ethan's small fingers. "That they can just take him away from us? Away from Ethan?" Mike leaned back in his chair, his expression sympathetic but realistic. "I'm saying that if this goes to court, you'll be fighting an uphill battle. But," he held up a finger, "there might be another approach. What if we could prove that Max is no longer suitable for search and rescue work? That his injuries have permanently affected his ability to perform the duties he was trained for?" Hope flickered in Jason's eyes. "Dr. Walker did say he would likely always have some impairment in that leg." "It's a start," Mike nodded. "But we'd need more than that. We'd need to demonstrate that removing Max from your family would cause significant emotional harm to Ethan. We'd need expert testimony about the unusual bond they share." Sarah straightened in her chair. "Dr. Ramirez, Ethan's pediatrician, has documented the improvement in his development since Max came into our lives. And Dr. Walker has observed their interaction numerous times." "Good." Mike made notes on a legal pad. "Now, there's one more angle we could pursue, though it's a bit of a long shot. If we could locate Max's original handler, Frank Miller, and get him to support your case, that might carry significant weight." Jason and Sarah exchanged glances. "The last we heard, he'd retired to Arizona after Max disappeared," Sarah said. "Do you think he'd help us?" Mike shrugged. "It's worth trying. From what you've told me about his comments in that news article, he had a deep connection with Max. He might be sympathetic to the bond Max has formed with Ethan." The search for Frank Miller proved more challenging than anticipated. The contact information in the old news articles was outdated, and the search and rescue organization refused to provide current details, citing privacy concerns. Jason spent his evenings after work, scouring social media and online directories, while Sarah reached out to veterinary associations and service dog training programs across Arizona. It was Dr. Walker who finally provided the breakthrough. "I have a colleague who worked with search and rescue teams in Pennsylvania," she told Sarah during one of Max's checkups. "She might know someone who could help us locate Frank." 2 days later, Dr. Walker called with a phone number. "His name is Robert Chen. He was Frank's supervisor at the search and rescue unit. He's retired now too, but he stayed in touch with Frank. He says Frank's living in a small town outside Phoenix." With trembling fingers, Sarah dialed the number Dr. Walker had provided. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Hello? Mr. Chen, my name is Sarah Mason. Dr. Walker from Michigan gave me your number. I'm calling about Frank Miller and Max." There was a long pause. "Max, the German shepherd that went missing in Pittsburgh?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "He's alive. He's with us now, in Michigan." Another pause, longer this time. "Lady, if this is some kind of joke—" "It's not a joke," Sarah interrupted. "We found Max, or rather our son found him, injured and abandoned in an old school building near our home. We've been taking care of him for months now. He's formed an incredible bond with our son, Ethan." Robert Chen's voice softened slightly. "How do you know it's the same dog? There are a lot of German shepherds out there. He has a tattoo in his ear, Service Animal Identification. Dr. Walker confirmed it with your organization. That's actually why I'm calling. They want him back, but Max is part of our family now. We were hoping Frank might be willing to speak on our behalf." The line went silent for so long that Sarah thought the call had dropped. Finally, Robert spoke. Again, his voice thick with emotion. "Frank never gave up hope, you know. Even after everyone else had moved on, he insisted Max was still out there somewhere. It nearly broke him when they finally declared the search over." He cleared his throat. "I think you should talk to him directly. Let me give you his number." That evening, with Ethan already asleep and Max keeping his usual vigil by the crib, Jason and Sarah sat at their kitchen table, staring at the phone between them. Frank Miller's number was dialed, but they hadn't yet pressed the call button. "What if he wants Max back for himself?" Sarah whispered, voicing the fear that had been growing since their conversation with Robert Chen. Jason took her hand. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but we have to try, Sarah, for Ethan, for Max." Sarah nodded and pressed the call button, putting the phone on speaker. As it rang, they both held their breath, unaware that this conversation would set in motion a chain of events that would reveal the true nature of the extraordinary connection between their son and the dog who had found his way into their lives. Frank Miller's voice was exactly as Sarah had imagined it would be, weathered and rough around the edges, but with an underlying gentleness that immediately put her at ease. "So you're telling me Max is alive?" he asked after Sarah had explained the situation. The disbelief in his tone was palpable even through the phone line. "After all this time?" "Yes, Mr. Miller. We found him, or rather, our son found him, about 4 months ago. He was injured and malnourished, but he's recovered remarkably well under our vet's care." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of Frank's slightly ragged breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had thickened with emotion. Can you send me a picture of him? I need to see for myself." Sarah glanced at Jason, who nodded and quickly took his phone to Ethan's room. He returned moments later with a photo of Max, lying protectively beside Ethan's crib, his intelligent eyes focused on the camera, as if he knew exactly what the picture was for. "I'll send it right now," Sarah said, and Jason forwarded the image to Frank's number. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Frank's voice returned, barely above a whisper. "That's him. That's my Max." He cleared his throat. The white marking on his chest, it looks like a crooked arrow. And his eyes, I'd know those eyes anywhere. Sarah exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. Mr. Miller, we need your help. The search and rescue organization wants Max back. They've sent legal notices. But Max is part of our family now. He and our son, Ethan, they have a connection that's hard to explain. Call me Frank, he replied automatically, still seemingly processing the news. And I understand unusual connections better than most folks. Might think, another pause. I need to see him in person. Can I come to Michigan? The request took Sarah by surprise, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. Of course, Frank would want to see Max after believing him lost for so long. Yes, of course, we'd welcome you to our home. I'll book a flight for next week, Frank said, his voice taking on a new determination. In the meantime, don't respond to those legal notices. Just tell them you're consulting with the original handler before making any decisions. That should buy us some time. After they hung up, Sarah looked at Jason with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Do you think we did the right thing, inviting him here? Jason wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I think we need to trust that the connection between Max and Ethan is strong enough to withstand whatever happens next, and Frank might be our best chance at keeping Max with us. The week passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. They prepared the guest room, bought groceries, and tried to explain to Ethan, in terms a toddler might understand, that a special visitor was coming to see Max. Ethan, with his limited vocabulary but seemingly boundless comprehension, nodded solemnly and said, Max's friend. Frank Miller arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Jason picked him up from the airport while Sarah stayed home with Ethan and Max. As they drove from Detroit back to Oak Ridge, Jason studied the older man from the corner of his eye. Frank was in his early 60s, with weather-beaten skin that spoke of years spent outdoors, and a slight stiffness in his movements that hinted at old injuries. His silver hair was cut short in a military style, and his hands, resting tensely on his knees, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to physical work. Thank you for coming all this way, Jason said, breaking the somewhat awkward silence that had fallen after their initial introductions. Frank nodded, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Wouldn't have missed it, not for anything. He turned to look directly at Jason. You have to understand, Max wasn't just a working dog to me. We were partners for 7 years. When I lost him in that collapse, his voice trailed off, and he cleared his throat before continuing. Well, a part of me was lost too. I think I understand, Jason replied carefully. The bond between Max and our son, it's something special, something I can't fully explain. Frank's expression softened slightly. Robert mentioned something about that. Said your boy found Max in an abandoned building? How'd that happen exactly? By the time Jason finished recounting the extraordinary circumstances of Max and Ethan's first meeting, they were pulling into the driveway of the Mason home. Frank fell silent again, his brow furrowed in thought. Sarah met them at the door, Ethan balanced on her hip. The toddler regarded Frank with curious eyes, but showed none of the shyness he typically displayed with strangers. Where's Max? Frank asked, his voice slightly unsteady. In the backyard, Sarah replied. We thought it might be best if you had a moment alone with him first. Frank nodded gratefully and followed Sarah through the house to the back door. As she opened it, he hesitated, taking a deep breath as if preparing himself for a momentous encounter. The reunion between Frank and Max was nothing short of extraordinary. The moment Max saw his former handler standing in the doorway, his entire demeanor transformed. His ears perked up, his tail began to wag furiously, and he let out a joyful bark that echoed through the yard. He bounded across the grass with surprising speed, given his previous injury, and nearly knocked Frank over in his enthusiasm. Frank dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the German Shepherd and burying his face in Max's fur. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I knew you were still out there, I knew it." Jason and Sarah exchanged glances, both blinking back tears at the powerful reunion. Ethan, however, wiggled down from Sarah's arms and toddled determinedly toward Max and Frank. "Max," he called, his small voice clear and confident. What happened next would later be described by Sarah as the moment she truly understood the depth of the connection between her son and the German Shepherd. Max, still clearly overjoyed at seeing Frank, turned at the sound of Ethan's voice. For a moment he seemed caught between two worlds, his past with Frank and his present with Ethan. Then, with gentle deliberation, he moved slightly away from Frank and positioned himself between the man and the toddler, as if creating a bridge between them. Frank watched this with an expression of wonder. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "He's chosen you, little man." That evening, after Ethan had been put to bed with Max taking up his customary position beside the crib, the adults gathered in the living room. Frank accepted the cup of coffee Sarah offered him and sat heavily in an armchair, looking both emotionally drained and somehow lighter than when he had arrived. "I've never seen anything quite like it," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "In all my years working with service dogs, I've never witnessed a bond like the one Max has with your son." He took a sip of his coffee. "Tell me again how Ethan found him." Jason and Sarah took turns recounting the events of that morning. How Ethan had somehow managed to unlock the back door and walk 6 blocks to the abandoned school. How he had shared his snack with the injured Max, and how they had found them together. Frank listened intently, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally. "Something that might help explain what happened." He set his coffee cup down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The building collapse in Pittsburgh where Max disappeared. It wasn't just any operation for us. It was our last one together. I was retiring, and Max was supposed to be reassigned to a new handler the following week." Frank rubbed a hand across his face. The building was an old apartment complex. Gas leak, structural failure. Most of the residents got out, but we knew there were still people trapped inside. Max and I were sent in to search the east wing. We'd cleared 2 floors when we heard the creaking. I knew we needed to get out, but Max... He shook his head. "Max caught a scent and took off down a hallway. He was tracking someone, and nothing would stop him once he had a trail." Frank's eyes grew distant with the memory. "I followed him as far as I could, but then part of the ceiling came down between us. I called for him, but he kept going. The last I saw, he was heading toward a unit at the end of the hall. Then the rest of that section collapsed, and I had to be pulled out by the other rescue workers." He looked up at Jason and Sarah, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "They searched for days, but there was no sign of Max. No, body, nothing. Most people assumed he'd been buried in the rubble. But I knew he was still out there somewhere. Max wouldn't quit until he finished what he started." Sarah leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "But what does this have to do with Ethan? With how they found each other?" Frank's gaze shifted to a family photo on the mantel, Jason, Sarah, and Ethan, taken when their son was just a few months old. "Where was Ethan born?" he asked abruptly. The question seemed so disconnected from their conversation that it took Sarah a moment to respond. "St. Mary's Hospital in Pittsburgh. We were visiting my sister when I went into labor 6 weeks early." "Why?" Frank's expression shifted, a look of dawning comprehension spreading across his weathered features. "When exactly was Ethan born? The date, I mean." "March 17th, 2023, Jason replied, increasingly confused by the line of questioning. Frank closed his eyes briefly, as if confirming something to himself. The building collapse was March 16th, 2023. The unit Max was heading toward at the end of that hallway. There was a pregnant woman inside. We didn't know it at the time, but she was in early labor. According to the reports, she was rescued and taken to St. Mary's Hospital, where she delivered a healthy baby despite the trauma. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. You can't possibly be suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, Frank said quietly. I'm just telling you what I know. Max was on a mission when I lost him, and somehow, against all odds, he found his way here, to your son. Make of that what you will. Silence filled the Masons' living room as the implications of Frank's words settled over them. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for Jason's, seeking an anchor in the face of a revelation that seemed too extraordinary to process. Are you saying, Jason began slowly, that Max was trying to rescue a pregnant woman? Possibly. The same woman who was in the hospital when Ethan was born, and then somehow, nearly 2 years later, Ethan was drawn to find Max in that abandoned school. Frank shrugged, his weathered face betraying a mixture of wonder and resignation. I'm not saying anything definitive. I'm just laying out the facts as I know them. The coincidences are remarkable. Sarah's mind raced through memories of her time at St. Mary's Hospital. She'd been admitted in a panic, her labor progressing rapidly despite being 6 weeks premature. The maternity ward had been unusually busy that day. The nurse had mentioned something about multiple emergency admissions. I remember there was a woman who came in from the building collapse, she said slowly. The nurses were talking about it. She was in the room next to mine. They said it was a miracle she and her baby survived. Frank nodded, unsurprised. That tracks with what I know. Her name was Elena Rodriguez. She was 8 months pregnant and alone in her apartment when the building started coming down. According to her statement afterward, she was trapped under some debris, unable to move, when she heard scratching at the door to her unit. She said she called out, and the next thing she knew, a dog was beside her, trying to create a path through the rubble. Max, Jason whispered. Had to be, Frank confirmed. Elena reported that the dog stayed with her, keeping her calm, until the rescue workers arrived. But in the chaos of getting her out, the dog disappeared again into the building. No one could figure out how a dog got to her in the first place. The rescue teams, with canine units, hadn't yet been cleared to enter that section. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. So Max saved Ethan before Ethan was even born, and then somehow Ethan saved Max. Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I've worked with search and rescue dogs for over 30 years. I've seen them do extraordinary things, find people buried under 20 feet of rubble, track scents that were days old, navigate terrain that would challenge the most experienced human rescuers. But this, he shook his head in wonder, this goes beyond training, beyond instinct even. What do we do now? Jason asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The search and rescue organization still wants Max back. Frank's expression hardened, with resolve. Leave that to me. I still have some influence there. Max has clearly found where he belongs. He glanced toward the stairs that led to Ethan's room. Some connections are too important to break. The following morning, Frank asked to accompany Jason to the abandoned school where Ethan had found Max. The building stood as it had for years, a decaying monument to better times, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring out at a world that had moved on without it. Hard to believe a toddler made it all the way here on his own, Frank remarked, as they picked their way through the debris-strewn courtyard. Jason nodded, still bewildered by that fact himself, and knew exactly where to find Max hidden away in a back corner of the building. They made their way through the main entrance, Jason leading Frank to the specific classroom where he had found Ethan and Max together. The space was unchanged. Broken chairs, torn posters, shattered glass crunching beneath their feet. Frank stood in the center of the room, turning slowly as he took in the scene. "You know what's strange?" he said finally. "Max was trained to stay with victims until help arrived. It was drilled into him from day one. Never leave someone you found, no matter what." Jason considered this. "So you're saying he should have stayed with Elena Rodriguez, but the report said he disappeared when the rescue workers arrived." "Exactly," Frank nodded. "It never made sense to me. Max wouldn't abandon a rescue mission unless—" He trailed off, his gaze fixed on something in the corner of the room. Jason followed his line of sight and saw what had caught Frank's attention: a faded poster, half torn from the wall, depicting a mother holding a baby. The caption, barely legible beneath years of dust and water damage, read, "Every child deserves a protector." Frank walked over and gently removed the poster from the wall, handling it with reverence. "Maybe Max didn't abandon his mission after all," he said quietly. "Maybe his mission just evolved." That afternoon, Frank made a series of phone calls from the Masons' living room. His side of the conversations was respectful but firm, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "Listen, Dave," he said to the current director of the search and rescue organization. "I've seen Max with this family. The dog has found his purpose here. He's protecting a child, doing exactly what we trained him to do." He paused, listening. "Yes, I understand the investment the organization has made, but consider the publicity angle. Instead of a legal battle that will make you look like you're tearing a beloved pet away from a toddler, you could be celebrating Max's extraordinary journey. A trained rescue dog who found his way across state lines to continue his mission of protection. That's the kind of story that would benefit everyone." By the end of the day, Frank had secured a provisional agreement. Max would be officially retired from service and his ownership transferred to the Mason family, on the condition that they allow the organization to use the story for promotional and educational purposes. Additionally, once Ethan was older, they would bring Max to visit schools and community events as an ambassador for search and rescue work. "It's a win-win," Frank explained, accepting the glass of celebratory whiskey Jason offered him. "They get a heartwarming story and positive publicity. You get to keep Max without a legal battle." Sarah hugged Frank impulsively, overcome with gratitude. "How can we ever thank you?" Frank's weathered face softened. "Seeing Max happy and fulfilled is all the thanks I need. Besides," he added with a small smile, "this gives me an excuse to visit regularly, if that's all right with you folks." "Of course," Jason assured him. "You'll always be welcome here. You're part of this story too." The next morning, as Frank prepared to return to Arizona, a small ceremony took place in the Masons' backyard. Frank knelt beside Max, removed the old service tag from his collar, and replaced it with a new one that read, "Max Mason, retired hero, forever home." "It's official, buddy," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion as he stroked Max's head. "You've completed your mission. You're home now." As if understanding the significance of the moment, Max licked Frank's hand once, then trotted over to Ethan, who was playing on a blanket in the grass. The toddler giggled as Max settled beside him, their extraordinary bond visible to everyone present. After Frank's departure, life in the Mason household gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though forever altered by the revelations of the past week. The legal threats from the search and rescue organization ceased, replaced by occasional requests for updates and photos for their newsletter. As summer faded into fall, Sarah found herself drawn to a project that had been forming in her mind since Frank's visit. With Jason's encouragement, she began researching the building collapse in Pittsburgh, particularly the story of Elena Rodriguez and her baby. It took several weeks of careful investigation, but Sarah finally located Elena through social media. She was living in Cleveland now, her son, born on the same day as Ethan, a healthy, thriving toddler named Miguel. After several tentative exchanges online, Sarah worked up the courage to share the full story of Max and Ethan with Elena. The response came almost immediately, a phone call filled with tears and astonishment. "I always wondered about that dog," Elena said, her voice wavering with emotion. "The one that found me in the rubble. The doctors said I was hallucinating from shock and pain, but I knew what I saw. A German shepherd with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand exactly what I needed." They arranged to meet halfway between their homes at a park in northern Ohio. On a crisp October morning, exactly 19 months after the building collapse, two families came together, connected by an extraordinary sequence of events that defied conventional explanation. Elena Rodriguez was a petite woman with warm brown eyes and a quiet strength about her. Her son, Miguel, shared Ethan's curious nature and energetic spirit. The two toddlers regarded each other with interest, but without the shyness typical of children their age. Max's reaction upon seeing Elena was subtle but unmistakable. He approached her slowly, his head tilted slightly as if trying to place a familiar scent. When she knelt to greet him, he pressed his nose gently against her hand, then looked back at Ethan as if confirming something to himself. "It's him," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's the same dog. I'd know those eyes anywhere." As the adults shared their perspectives on the remarkable chain of events that had brought them together, the children played nearby, supervised by Max, who positioned himself strategically to keep both toddlers in his sight. "I don't know if we'll ever fully understand what happened," Sarah said, watching as Ethan and Miguel built a tower of leaves together. "How Max found his way to our town, how Ethan knew where to find him." Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "My grandmother would have called it destino, destiny. Some connections transcend what we can explain." That evening, after returning home from their meeting with Elena and Miguel, Sarah found Jason standing in Ethan's doorway, watching their son sleep with Max curled protectively at the foot of his new toddler bed. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her arm around his waist. "The abandoned school," Jason replied, his voice low to avoid waking Ethan. "I think we should do something about it." Sarah looked up at him, curious. "What do you mean?" "It's just sitting there, falling apart, but it's where everything changed for us. It feels wrong to leave it like that." 3 months later, on a snowy January morning, the Mason family stood with Frank Miller, Elena and Miguel Rodriguez, Dr. Walker, and dozens of community members as the mayor of Oak Ridge cut a ribbon stretched across the entrance of what had once been the abandoned school. Where decay and neglect had reigned, a new community center now stood, the result of a grassroots effort spearheaded by Jason and supported by local businesses, volunteers, and a sizable donation from the search and rescue organization that had once trained Max. The central courtyard had been transformed into a small park, dominated by a simple bronze statue of a German shepherd, standing protectively beside a child. The plaque at its base read, "Where innocence leads, salvation follows," in honor of extraordinary connections that remind us we are never truly lost. As snow began to fall more heavily, the crowd moved inside for the reception. Max, now wearing a special vest identifying him as a retired service dog, moved comfortably through the gathering, accepting pats and treats with dignified grace. Ethan, now approaching his 3rd birthday, stayed close to his canine protector, occasionally reaching up to touch his fur, as if reassuring himself of Max's presence. Dr. Walker approached Sarah with a tablet in hand, her expression animated. "You won't believe this," she said. "Remember the security camera footage of Max pulling Ethan away from the stairs? The one you posted on social media? It's been used in a national campaign promoting rescue dog adoption. The views are in the millions." Sarah smiled, watching as Frank knelt to speak with Ethan and Miguel, who listened with rapt attention as the retired handler told them simplified stories of rescue missions. It's amazing how one connection can create so many ripples. Later, that evening, as the community center emptied and the Mason family prepared to head home, Ethan broke away from his parents and ran to the bronze statue in the courtyard. Standing before it, he placed his small hand on the metal representation of Max, then turned to the real Max with a smile of perfect understanding. "Forever," he said clearly, a word he had only recently added to his rapidly expanding vocabulary. Max moved to his side, pressing against him gently as snowflakes gathered on both their heads. In that moment, with the transformed school behind them and an unexpected future ahead, the circle that had begun in the chaos of a building collapse in Pittsburgh seemed somehow complete. And yet, as Jason and Sarah watched their son and his extraordinary companion framed against the falling snow, they understood that their story, a tale of invisible connections, second chances, and the mysterious ways in which lives become intertwined, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. From an abandoned school to a place of community, from a lost mission to a new purpose, from strangers to family, their journey had come full circle, guided by the purest instincts of a child and the unwavering devotion of a dog who had traveled hundreds of miles to fulfill a promise that transcended understanding. As they walked home through the gentle snowfall, Max leading the way with Ethan's small hand resting on his back, the lesson seemed clear. Some bonds are formed long before we recognize them. Some missions continue in ways we never anticipated. And sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are found not in grand rescues, but in the quiet, daily devotion that turns strangers into family and houses into homes. Dear listeners, we hope that the extraordinary journey of Ethan and Max has touched your hearts. This tale of invisible connections and second chances reminds us that some bonds transcend explanation. They simply exist, pure and powerful. For more emotionally captivating stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist that explores the mysterious ways lives become intertwined. You can find it by clicking to your left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexity and the beautiful connections that define us. We look forward to reading your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.